The origin of the I Ching is rooted in Neolithic Chinese shamanic culture. When we say Neolithic China, we're talking about 10,000 BC to around 2000 BC. So this is over 12,000 years ago from today. Okay, the I Ching itself, in the form of the 64 hexagrams as we know it today, isn't dated until the Zhou dynasty, sometime between 1000 BC and 750 BC. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself right now, so let's start at the very beginning. So the I Ching is premised on the mathematical permutation of the Bagua, or 8 trigrams, which essentially represents the 8 fundamental building blocks of both physical and metaphysical or spiritual life. So the universe is a cohesive singular organism with a soul called Qi, a universal collective life force comprised of a binary, yin and yang, and how yin and yang interact with each other in every possible permutation or form is expressed in these 8 fundamental trigrams or elements. So these 8 trigrams are the building blocks of all life. Again, I'm so sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. That particular topic is going to be addressed later in cosmology. So right now we're just trying to focus on history and culture. But I needed to lay that foundation first because the 8 trigrams principle is rooted in Neolithic China, traced back to a shamanic king, Emperor Fu Xi, when he conceived of the He-Tu spiral sequence. The shamanic king Fu Xi declared that this magic square was a map of the universe and represented an expanding universe theory, which, by the way, in the 1800s, Edwin Hubble proved to be true. Then in the Xia dynasty, around 2000 BC to 1000 BC, another shamanic king, Yu the Great, rearranged the He-Tu to create a second magic square of 9 numbers, the Luoshu, which has now come to represent the later heaven Bagua. The early heaven Bagua represents the universe as it is in its organic and natural state. The later heaven Bagua represents a communion between mankind and the universe. In other words, the later heaven Bagua represents alchemy. During the Xia dynasty, tortoise-shell divination using the Luoshu magic square, the Luoshu magic square, was practiced by female priestesses who were often the queens or concubines of the emperor. So we know this because of the records that were kept on those tortoise shells with script denoting the female gender of the practitioner rather than male. So up to this point, we have 8 trigrams, the Bagua, both the early heaven and the later heaven versions, one representing the natural state of the universe and the other representing alchemy, divination, and high magic. So with this, we enter the Shang dynasty around 1600 BC and 1050 BC. At this time, another shamanic king, Zhou Wenwang, or King Wen, known in English, is imprisoned by the emperor of the Shang dynasty. And during his imprisonment, he takes the 8 trigrams of the Bagua, the early heaven and the later heaven forms, figures out their permutations, and conceives of the 64 hexagrams that came to be known as the I Ching, Book of Changes. Now, using these 64 hexagrams, King Wen performed a divination by invoking Shangdi, the celestial emperor, or our heavenly father. That's what Shangdi translates as. More on that later. And the mandate of heaven was passed to the Zhou family name. So through his divination, Zhou Wenwang, or King Wen, predicted the fall of the Shang dynasty and the rise of the Zhou dynasty. And true to his prediction, King Wen's heirs overthrew the Shang and established the Zhou dynasty. So now we enter 1046 BC, and here during the Zhou dynasty, lasting until around 256 BC, is when we see the rise of Taoism and Lao Tzu, considered the founding thought leader of Taoism, and his seminal text of Taoism, the Tao Te Ching. So the Tao Te Ching, not to be confused with the I Ching, was written around 600 to 500 BC, give or take, which is about 500 years after the I Ching. Then the Zhuangzi, another well-known seminal text in Taoism, was written 700 years after the I Ching. So the I Ching 64 hexagrams as a divinatory tool predates Lao Tzu and Taoism. History reveals that the I Ching was born out of Chinese shamanism, but as we enter the Zhou dynasty and Taoism develops with I Ching divination seen as a high art associated with the emperor and with the mandate of heaven, meaning there's a connection line here between the celestial emperor Sangdi, God, and the earthly emperor who is ruling China. So there's this sense that I Ching is reserved for the elite, and Taoism started to develop at this time also among the aristocracy. Therefore, it made sense syncretically for Taoism and the I Ching to merge in the Zhou dynasty and thereon after. So now we are seeing something close to 2,500 years of syncretic merger between Taoism and the I Ching. That's why we now understand why they're tethered together and why they are considered bedfellows, but they did develop at separate points in time. During the Qin dynasty, now we're talking about 221 to 206 BC, this is only lasting around 15 years, is when we see the rise of occult forms of Taoism. So this is right after the Zhou dynasty when we see the conception of the I Ching. In the Qin dynasty, you have what we refer to as, or what scholars refer to as Neo-Taoism. Neo-Taoism is essentially occult Taoism. Neo-Taoism is the ceremonial magical arm of Taoism. Occult Taoism took the Taoist philosophy of Lao Tzu and, like I said, pretty much just optimized it for ceremonial magic, alchemy, divination, and thaumaturgy, basically miracle working. Here's when you see the rise in popularity of using the I Ching Book of Changes for both divination and magic. The Qin dynasty, although lasting only a few decades, considered a relatively short dynasty in Chinese history, is interesting for its ruler, Qing Huang, who undertook the building of the Great Wall of China, and also the Terracotta Army, and was obsessed with achieving immortality through the elixir of life. He was obsessed with discovering the elixir of life, and that's similar to the quest for the Philosopher's Stone if you're using Western mystery traditions. And Qing Huang hired pretty much a legion of court magicians, shamans, and alchemists, and they were dedicated, and he dedicated an enormous amount of the nation's resources to Neo-Taoism or occult Taoism to try to discover the elixir of life. So at this time, incidental because the emperor was trying so hard to discover the elixir of life, the Philosopher's Stone, incidentally from that, Neo-Taoism or occult Taoism tethered with the I Ching rose in popularity and rose in power during this time. Now, also during the Qin dynasty, divination with the I Ching 64 hexagrams was integral to the Chinese consciousness, at least at the imperial and aristocratic levels. Oh, here's another interesting point. So today we consider the I Ching Book of Changes to be steeped in Confucianism, and it is. However, during the Qin dynasty, here's what we know. So divination with the I Ching was prevalent among the elite and was integral to Chinese shamanic culture at that time, but Confucianism was outlawed by Qing Huang. So it wouldn't be unreasonable to draw the conclusion that, at least at this time, this is 200 BC, even though I Ching and Confucianism started up and coexisted throughout Chinese history, at least during this time when Neo-Taoism or occult Taoism was thriving through the Qing Huang era, the I Ching Book of Changes and Confucianism was kept quite separate. This is going to be relevant in a little bit. Also, during the Qin dynasty, the primary religion was premised around a spirit world coexisting as an additional dimension overlapping or superimposed over the physical material world. Certain priests or priestesses called wu or shamans possessed the exclusive, and I think that's pretty important to emphasize, it was viewed as exclusive, a gift for communicating and interacting with that spirit world. So the I Ching Book of Changes was used as a communication and interactive tool with the spirit world from the physical realm. And so basically, the I Ching was an ancient Chinese Ouija board. So obviously, don't quote me on that. I mean, I'm kidding, but actually I'm not. The intent and mechanics of the I Ching during the Qin dynasty in operation is remarkably similar to what we would associate with as a Ouija board or a spirit board. So right now, we are still in 200 BC. Confucianism is outlawed, but the I Ching is one of the primary divinatory tools for priests, magicians, and shamans to commune with the spirit realm. And we have an emperor who is obsessed with the study of the occult and alchemy so that he might discover the elixir of life, which to the Western magical world would be called the Philosopher's Stone. Therefore, it stands to reason that the I Ching at this time is pretty much tied to the occult forms of Taoism rather than Confucianism, and in fact would have been distanced altogether from Confucianism. So here's what we have so far. We've got the 64 diagrams that are the hexagrams with the yin and yang lines, and each hexagram has a name which would have been denoted at this time with Chinese oracle bone script. As for the verses or the text that's often associated with the I Ching, that's pretty much what's contentious. According to legend, allegedly, the original version of the I Ching verses, called the 10 Wings or Zoe, was written by Confucius, who lived between 550 BC and around 479 BC. So this is near the tail end of the Zhou dynasty. We're skipping around here. We talked about the Zhou, then we moved into Qin. Now we're going back to the Zhou, just to sort of place Confucius in history. So around the time Taoism was coming in, and that's around the time the mandate of heaven had passed. Later on in that dynasty, it was a really long ass dynasty, but toward the tail end of the dynasty is when you have Confucius coming up. Okay, so back to the Qin dynasty. We know that anybody who was anybody in the occult or magical world, so to speak, would have been proficient with the I Ching as a divinatory tool to commune with the spirit world, sanctioned by the Qin emperor, and yet Confucianism was banned at this time. So if Confucius wrote the 10 Wings, or the verses, the text to the I Ching as we know it, which to today's modern practitioner is an integral part of the Book of Changes, would the 10 Wings have been used as part of the I Ching during the Qin dynasty? Now that's a really good question. And it doesn't make a lot of sense how it would go, because the answer isn't unanimous, and there's no way to really reconcile that inconsistency. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because it determines what original form of divination the I Ching would have been used for. So it could be either claromancy or bibliomancy, right? Claromancy is a form of divination where you're utilizing a random casting of lots system, and the randomization is believed to be not so random, but rather some form of divine revelation. Bibliomancy is a form of divination that's pretty much using, it's receiving prophetic messages from sacred texts. So we're pretty sure in the Zhou dynasty, Zhou Wenwang or King Wen used the I Ching for claromancy. But now that we're in the Qin dynasty, the height of occult Taoism, which is important or at least interesting for the practitioner of craft, and the I Ching has now been integrated into occult Taoism, or what scholars refer to as Neo-Taoism. If you're an occult practitioner looking to understand the origins and history of the I Ching, I would say that it kind of matters what form of divination the I Ching took during the height of occult Taoism and I Ching's sort of connection with each other. And it's really hard to say either way. First, you have to address the question of whether the text, the Ten Wings, was actually written by Confucius. If yes, if it was written by Confucius, then in all likelihood it was banned during the Qin dynasty. And so the I Ching as a divinatory form would have been cleromancy with just the lines of the 64 hexagrams and none of the text as we know it. And therefore it would not be in any shape or form bibliomancy. So, but if Confucius did not write the Ten Wings, and the Ten Wings or the text of the I Ching is not attributable to Confucius, then it's hard to say. Maybe it was part of the divinatory system of I Ching during the Qin dynasty, during the height of occult Taoism. Then at that point, when I Ching and occult Taoism were merged, I Ching would have been bibliomancy. So it's really hard to say which it was. I just thought that was interesting. Okay, moving on. Then we enter the Han Dynasty. This is from 200 BC to 200 AD, when every scholar sitting for the Chinese imperial civil service exams would have had to memorize the I Ching Book of Changes to become a civil servant or government official. If you were anybody that was part of the aristocracy or the educated elite, you needed to have memorized the I Ching. So the civil service exams tested your knowledge and your interpretation of the I Ching and your results. So how you interpreted the 64 hexagrams would have been part of determining your role in society, the roles or positions you would have filled in government or in the high court. Now, the practice of these imperial service examinations didn't end until the 1890s. So for much of Chinese history, yes, the I Ching was treated more academically. It was treated as a scholarly text on Chinese philosophy, more so than it was as a form of occultism. Though a true account of history, as you can see, the earliest modalities of the I Ching were occult in nature. Okay, now in the Han Dynasty, we see the I Ching, Taoism, and now Confucianism coming in and having these three bodies of thought merging. From the Han Dynasty onward, the I Ching is very much entering the mainstream Chinese culture and consciousness. Now from 200 BC, marking the rise of the Han Dynasty, all the way until about 600 AD, or around 800 years of history, the I Ching is pretty much seen as secular or exoteric rather than esoteric. And so it's essentially treated as an academic text, like I said, something that scholars of all walks had to study to better understand Chinese philosophy. Now let's kind of skip all the way through the annals of Chinese history, all the way now to the Tang Dynasty. Now the Tang Dynasty is 600 AD until 600 to 900 AD. So just to give Westerners a frame of reference, over in Europe during the Tang Dynasty is going on in China during 600 to 900 AD. Over in Europe, you've got the Dark Ages, or the early Dark Ages, actually, the Middle Ages. And so that just gives you a sense of what's going on in various parts of the world. Now, during the Tang Dynasty, Confucianism is a big deal, and so is Taoism. Anybody who is anybody would have at this time been subscribed to both schools of thought. You would have identified as both a Confucianist and a Taoist. And so the two do become syncretized. The lines that separate the I Ching from Taoism and Confucianism now really begin to blur, and you really do see that in the texts of the I Ching. So for example, the concept of Junzi, you see Junzi, the idea is the perfect gentleman, which I translate as sage. Junzi is a Confucianist concept and is used throughout the I Ching text to indicate what the modern day practitioner would say as the higher self. So I like to say it represents the higher self. It was translated as the sage, meaning the optimized version of yourself. But yeah, it does sort of spring from a Confucianist principle. Now, here's something quite fascinating about the Tang Dynasty social structure. So, women, of course, held a subordinate, inferior position at this time, and there's all of that strict gender normative regulations going on between men and women that we've all come to associate with Confucianism. All of that was in effect. However, there was one really clear exception to this rule, and that was the social class of Taoist priestesses. Taoist priestesses, they did not have to follow the Confucianist order, and they were pretty much the only women excluded or given an exception to that Confucianist rule. These were educated women, they were born from the aristocracy, they were usually of wealth and prestige, and they were fiercely independent. They were pretty much the only women who were allowed to have sex outside of the institution of marriage and still hold on to their high social status in society. So this is unlike, in comparison, courtesans and prostitutes. So they were a very different social class of women from that. These Taoist priestesses during the Tang Dynasty were valued for their prophetic gifts. That's why they were given these exceptions. They were believed to possess the gift, the exclusive gift of communing with the deities, communing with the spirit realms, and that's why they were given that exception. They were often the more sought after women for the emperor's concubines, and anytime, at any given time, a handful of the emperor's concubines would have been Taoist priestesses because they were, again, given an exceptional status in society. And they were believed to be able to perform ceremonial magic, divination. They were able to lead rituals in the imperial court, and they were believed to possess mediumship gifts and the ability to channel the spirit realms. Now I want to skip over to the Song Dynasty around 960 AD to 1279 AD, when we have some records of the I Ching Book of Changes being used by ceremonial magicians and Taoist priests for performing exorcisms. So now we have records of the I Ching and exorcisms syncretizing and being merged or having some relevancy with each other. However, before the I Ching's merger with ceremonial magic, before we can develop this further, the Song Dynasty falls and we have this foreign occupation of China by the Mongols. This is now the Yuan dynasty. So we really didn't get to see that much of a development of the I Ching with exorcism or more, the occult Taoism and I Ching syncretism didn't really get to develop that much during the Song dynasty because it immediately fell. Now we have the Yuan dynasty when Mongols basically took over China, foreign invasion, 1279 to 1368 AD. And the Yuan dynasty, Buddhism was the favored religion of the time. It was the official religion at the cost of Taoism, unfortunately. So at this time, Taoism is suppressed, especially Taoist occultism. The Yuan emperor and the foreigners were very much afraid and fearful of Taoist magic, and so it was suppressed and pretty much banned at this time. The Mongols were overthrown later on by, and this is one of my favorite stories in Chinese history, actually, so you do want to look this up later on, but an orphaned peasant boy who became a Buddhist monk overthrew the Yuan dynasty and restored China back to Chinese or Han people's rule, and now we enter the Ming dynasty. You do see a reclamation period here for Taoist alchemy, again, because you have the Chinese or the Han people taking back their nation. There's also this revival of all things that are native to the culture. Taoism is the only religion native to China, and so you have this revival of Taoism as both a religion and a philosophy. Taoist alchemy was big during this time, the Ming dynasty, and then right after the Ming dynasty you have the Qing dynasty. Now we're back down to the decline of Taoist magic. The Qing dynasty spans 1600s, or not 1600s, 1640s, 1640s to the early 1900s. And so by this time, we no longer believe in magic or superstition, right? The I Ching may have been interesting to some Chinese scholars for its historic value, and surely the philosophical value of the text is, provocative, but it's no longer a divinatory tool. And if you wanted to be seen as educated or intellectual, then there's no way you would have been associating the I Ching with occultism or the I Ching with divination. So culturally, at this time, in the mainstream Chinese consciousness, the I Ching as a divinatory tool is now on the decline. In fact, it's pretty much ridiculed. At this time, also, the I Ching would have been considered fairly obscure. And during the Qing dynasty, this is when Richard Wilhelm, a Christian missionary, entered China and discovered the I Ching, bringing the text back to the Western world and producing what is still today one of the most, if not the most, famous translations of the I Ching for the Western world. So finally, let's talk about what exactly constitutes the I Ching. The only part of the I Ching that's unanimous is that there are these 64 images of the hexagrams comprising of yin and yang lines, but which is which in terms of numbering from 1 to 64 actually differs in various versions. For those watching this video lecture who are tarot readers or coming from a tarot background, and there's a lot of you, the best analogy I can give is how the Tarot de Marseille system of tarot has key 8 of the major arcana as justice and key 11 as strength, whereas in the more popular Rider-Waite-Smith system, key 8 is strength and key 11 is justice. So there's that sort of switch around. In that kind of same manner, some of the hexagrams in the I Ching are changed around based on which version you're looking at. Now, there are 3 main versions of the I Ching when you're talking about the text portion. There's the Guizang, which tends to correspond various Chinese myths and legends with the hexagrams, the Liansang, and then the Zhou. So both the Guizang and Zhou are associated with the Zhou dynasty, with the Zhou, of course, being alleged as having been authored by Confucius himself, though a whole bunch of scholars vehemently disagree with the assertion. So there's also this sentiment now that maybe the Zhou, the older version of the I Ching, became associated with Confucius, mainly for branding purposes, kind of to give it more legitimacy and to give it more oomph and credibility over the centuries. But there is a contention as to whether or not the Zhou was written and actually written by Confucius. And that's why I gotten so much into all of that talk earlier during the Qin dynasty about whether or not, the 10 Wings was written by Confucius and whether or not the I Ching was cleromancy or bibliomancy during the Qin dynasty. So if you want to talk facts, we don't actually know where the text portion, like I said, of the I Ching Book of Changes came from. We just don't have any incontrovertible records of who authored it. We can't even say, for a matter of fact, which dynasty it came out of. Practitioners of craft, a rather specific subset of those who work with the I Ching Book of Changes, and who I would argue are using the I Ching in its original intended form, tend to believe that the text was channeled from the divine. So there's this idea that wherever it came from, it was channeled by whatever practitioners memorialized the verses, and it was channeled from the divine. It was used to memorialize a tool so that man could communicate with heaven. Basically, heaven was giving us a tool, teaching us the language of speaking with heaven. So this language was a binary code of yin and yang that forms the 64 hexagrams, and that is the documented language of the divine. or maybe as what modern psychologists would call it, the collective unconscious, or New Agers would say it's the Akashic records. However you want to express it, the yin and yang binary code is the fundamental building blocks of the language we use to communicate with the divine. Now, in the I Ching, and as it would have been expressed during the Zhou dynasty and in Neolithic China, that divine was called Sangdi, which we translate as the celestial emperor. Sangdi basically means the celestial king. Another term for the divine Sangdi is Lao Tianye, and you hear that a lot. Lao Tianye basically means the ancient heavenly father. So this to me is significant, and so remember that point as we move on to the next video lecture on the I Ching, divinity, and cosmology.